Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Intercede Group PLC investor presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab that's just situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Please just simply type in your questions and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all of the questions that are submitted today and publish responses where it is appropriate to do so. Before we begin, I would like to submit the following poll, and if you could give that your kind attention, I'm sure the company would be most grateful. I'd now like to hand you over to CEO Klaas van der Leest. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Jake. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Klaas van der Leest. I'm the CEO for Intercede. I would like to welcome both existing investors as well as potentially new private investors to this session. We will cover an update on the Authlogics acquisition as announced last week, as well as a trading update for the period 1st of April until the 30th of September. During this session, I'm joined by Nitin Patel, who's our CFO, and Alan Story, who's our Chief Product Officer. They both play a critical part in the presentation. We look forward to providing you with an update in the coming 45 minutes. And whilst this presentation is us presenting to you, we very much look forward to your questions and indeed feedback after the session. So without further ado, let's start with the presentation. A couple of disclaimers. So for anybody who's been following us for a little while, we've very much been talking about phase one and phase two. Phase one was very much about restructuring the business, reorganizing, investing in the product, MyID, investing in our product roadmap, making sure that we have a strong go-to-market model. And clearly the aim is to use that as a platform for further growth, both organically as well as inorganically. Towards the end of this presentation, we'll provide an update on our trading update, but this presentation is very much focused on the M&A side, Authlogics. And as we're highlighting here, M&A is very much part of our strategy. We've been very, very clear in communicating that over the last 12 to 15 months. Our head of corporate development is very active in the market, and Authlogics is the first deal we're announcing. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to provide a quick executive summary overview, which I'll share with Nitin. Alan will then do the bulk of the presentation about combination rationale as well as products overview. I then take it back, talk about the markets we've entered, particularly relative market size, target account market, etc., as well as the markets that Authlogics is already operating in. We then conclude, and then we move on to the Q&A, and we welcome your questions as we go along in the presentation, which will be answered towards the end. So what have we acquired? We've acquired a UK headquartered company in Bracknell called Authlogics. It's a relatively small company, but got a very strong product. They're offering both MFA, multi-factor authentication, as well as password security management. We've been looking at quite a few companies over the last 12 months, but in the end, we decided this was an interesting play for us. It's a strong IP play. We've got a technology stack that's very familiar to us, so we think integration is going to be relatively straightforward. In addition to MFA, they bring the password security manager. Alan will provide more detail on that, but that allows us to really come down the authentication pyramid. And they've got a strong client base. Even though it's a small company, this technology is proven out in the market, and we believe we can expand that much wider. We've got a little bit of background noise here, so I don't know, Nitin, Alan, if you can go on mute. So we're acquiring IP here. We clearly looked at the classic: do we partner, do we build, or do we buy? Partnering is clearly not without risk, considering there's a fair amount of consolidation going on in the market. We looked at building it ourselves. We quickly concluded it would take 2 to 3 years to bring this technology to market. In the meantime, the market would have moved on, and the market is there. The market is there today, very much driven by regulation as well. Again, Alan will talk about FIPS 201-3. It's North American regulation and standards. That's actually quite beneficial to us. Other than that, we are coming down that pyramid. We will be capable of offering solutions both from passwords to PKI, so from the bottom of the pyramid to the top, but also in reverse order. We're looking at an addressable market that's materially bigger than where we've been before. And from a sales cycle perspective, we do think these sales cycles tend to be a little bit shorter than what we've used to traditionally in the core PKI world. When we look at deal financials, I'm going to hand you over on to Nitel.
Thanks, Klaas, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm assuming everyone's read the RNS, but just as an update, as Klaas has said, this is very much an IP deal for us, and Alan will explain what we're doing moving down the pyramid. On the financial aspect of this deal, it's a small company based in Bracknell, UK, so that's good news for us. It's got annual recurring revenues of $500,000, and we used a multiple of 5 for that, and hence the initial consideration was based on that to 2.5 million. We actually paid out 2 million after adjustments for working capital and for long-term debt, which is the deferred income aspect, which we reduced the initial consideration to 2 million. And then what we did was we then negotiated a deferred consideration payable over 3 years, as shown over there, for 0.5, 1.05, and 1.45 million. And that is based on achieving significant revenue growth within the Authlogics portfolio, and that's on recognized revenues in those years. Based on that, we believe that the initial consideration was paid through our existing cash resources, and going forward, it will be paid through the cash flow from the revenue streams from Authlogics and obviously from the wider group as required. So this is a really good deal for us from an IP standpoint of view. It's a good deal for us from the integration point of view, and we believe we've structured in such a way that we, as a group, will benefit from the revenue streams and therefore the valuation aspects as the company increases its revenues across the piece.
Thank you, Nitil. That concludes the first part, so we're moving into combination rationale. I will hand you over to Alan Story, who's the Chief Product Officer. Alan?
Thank you, Klaas. So you've seen an example of us both clicking the slide at the same time here. There we go. So we've used this authentication pyramid for a few years now to describe the strength of authentication. Our customers have a common goal. They want to protect themselves against data breach. They want to do that by moving away from the most common form of data breach, which is a compromised credential. So we have lower forms of security at the bottom of the pyramid, passwords, and the highest forms of security at the top, PKI, typically issued on a hardware device such as a smart card issued to a particular policy. So that's the place at the top of the pyramid Intercede have played for a number of years now. PKI has been the gold standard of authentication, used widely in governments, aerospace and defense, and military customers. Moving into that space is FIDO. So FIDO started off as a consumer technology and is now an emerging technology in that enterprise space as well. That particular pyramid shows the level of security, but it also serves to show the addressable market. So we are playing in a niche, which means there are limited customers at the top end of that particular pyramid. It's a good place to be. It's very sticky. Once we're in there, customers tend to keep our technology in. It's a less competitive space than some other areas, and it's a high value space. However, moving down the pyramid, there is a considerably broader addressable market, which before the acquisition of Authlogics, Intercede were missing on. So that's the first part this brings us. With the acquisition of Authlogics, we can move down that pyramid and we can address a wider range of authentication needs. So some of the more traditional mechanisms of authentication, a one-time code generated on your phone, a push notification to your phone, using a software or a hardware token there. So not as secure as the very top end of security, but secure enough for a large number of organizations, sometimes smaller to medium organizations, but also larger organizations who don't need to go all the way to the very top of the pyramid. So step one, it allows us to have more in our combined sales team's kit bag to sell to people immediately. But there is a second piece this gives us as well. And that allows us to start looking at, as organizations want to move up the pyramid from passwords through MFA to PKI and FIDO, what legislation do they need to comply with? FIPS 201 has been a legislation in the US which has helped Intercede's business over the last 10-15 years. This states that all federal government employees must have a strong credential, it must be issued, and it must be managed to a certain policy. And that's exactly what our product does. So that's been very good for us. The latest iteration of this standard has changed its approach. The original standard said you have to have a PKI credential. It's the only one we trust. Now, the update to the standard says, depending upon the risk of the information you're protecting, you can use a wider range of authentication technologies. So you can, for example, use PKI as your primary ID, but pushing this down the supply chain, then software OTP or hardware OTP is enough if it's managed and deployed in a certain way. So that opens up a second opportunity for Intercede. So not only can we deploy to new types of customers in new environments where we previously didn't have a solution, this allows us to go back to our existing customers and existing types of customers and provide a much broader solution to them. So for example, some of our existing customers use us to manage their PKI. They use other vendors to manage their multi-factor authentication, and they use other vendors to look after the security of their passwords. This acquisition allows us to approach those customers and say, we will manage your authentication of whatever strength you need within that particular pyramid, all the way from passwords up to PKI. We have a solution for you. And importantly, we can do that compliant with those legislation standards, and we can migrate you between the technologies. So unlike a siloed solution delivered by different vendors, we can provide a single solution with a single pane of glass managing all those credentials and migrate you between them. Okay, so I'm going to look on and talk about the actual product set we've bought and the organization that's coming to Intercede. So as mentioned, it's primarily an IP deal. We've brought the product in. We've been through a substantial period of due diligence. We're very comfortable in the product. We've looked at it from a security perspective, from a code review perspective, and also the fact that it's actually deployed in 44 customers at the moment. So we know it's out there, we know it works, we're comfortable with the product. The number of people we're bringing on board is relatively small, but they are subject matter experts in their area. So Intercede have been working in strong authentication digital identities for a number of years. We are bringing in some knowledge on MFA and password security management into the business that I'm confident our team will take on board very, very quickly. We have a strong integration plan. So we're looking at bringing the technology and the organization in. So we're controlling the sales, the finance, the product management as a single organization. The intention is from day one, we have an expanded portfolio of products that our joint sales team can sell into existing and new customers immediately. And over time, we'll integrate the product set so we have that single pane of glass to manage wherever anybody is on their authentication journey from passwords to PKI, and that makes the solution unique. Initially, we talked about new items in the kit bag to sell from day one. So that's the top grey area, the top grey box here. So Intercede already provide registration ID verification. So for some of the more advanced programs, not only do we need to issue somebody a credential, we need to make sure they are who they claim to be before we can issue that credential. So that's things like capturing passports, driving licenses, facial biometrics, photos, passing those to background checking systems. Is this person on a known terrorist list? Do they actually meet the set of data they've provided? So we have a strong identity before we issue a credential. The next one in from the left, MyD credential management system, that's issuing those high assurance PKI and FIDO credentials to an individual and managing their life cycle. With the Authlogics product suite, we can also then do that for multi-factor authentication, so a more traditional range of authentication mechanisms other than PKI and FIDO, and we can start managing passwords as well. This is not a one and done from a growth perspective, from a mergers and acquisitions perspective. So the next level down is where we're starting to look. So we will go through a market analysis, we'll go through a full due diligence process. So view these as indicative of the sorts of areas we're starting to look at for the next step. But it's really adding into the strength of that authentication pyramid coverage. So single sign-on is a potential. There are many organizations in healthcare and government who have legacy password-based applications that are difficult to enable for stronger authentication. But there are solutions out there that will take those passwords, scramble them so the user doesn't know them, replay them at the application. So I, as a user, can strongly authenticate to a single system, and then it will authenticate me into the applications. So that's one area we're considering. The other one we're considering is what's called ongoing authorization. So this is bound into the concept of zero trust, where just because somebody's logged on the network securely doesn't mean we should continue to trust them for the rest of their operations. And this is very much in use in the banking industry with consumers today. So if I use my contactless card on a reader, now and again it will ask me to insert my card and enter my PIN. So that's step-up authentication. Sometimes if I'm performing a transaction, it may ask me to authorize that in an app if it's an unusual transaction or it's a certain amount. So that concept is moving into the world of the enterprise. Somebody logged onto the network and they're allowed to move around the network as soon as they perform a particularly secure operation. So potentially signing an email, approving a financial transaction, editing a firewall policy. We might then look at that and ask for additional authentication. If they're actually performing an operation and suddenly the IP address is one in China, as opposed to where they started, again, can flag a risk. So that's an interesting area we see as bringing into that portfolio to strengthen that solution set. Looking at the IP we've actually brought into the company, so the product set. So the two areas on the right are the Authlogics products that are actually licensed and sold immediately. So password security management, are your passwords as secure as they can be? And multi-factor authentication. So I'll talk about those. But interestingly, underpinning this, there is a password breach database. What that consists of is a cloud-based database of known compromised passwords. There are two sources of data for that. One of them is whenever there's a data breach, typically that will get published on the internet, so known usernames and passwords, and that will appear in this database. So this is an amalgamation of data from multiple sources. So for example, a number of years ago, the Sony PlayStation network was breached. There were millions of usernames and passwords that people used to access that PlayStation network published, and hackers can then buy that password database. They can buy tools to play those at multiple systems. So the first one is known compromised credentials. The second one is what's known as a hacker's dictionary. So if I were naive enough to use a password Alan123, which I'm not, then a hacker would take that if that was breached, and they would also work out, well, perhaps Alan uses Alan234 or Alan ABC. So they would create some likely passwords, but those are out there in known hackers' databases, and they're being used to try and compromise systems. So that is the amalgamation of data in that system. It's a huge database. It has over 4 billion credentials in there. There are other products in this area. Have I Been Pawned is a common one, but this is twice as big as that database. So it's the largest conglomeration of known compromised credentials in the world, and it's updated on a regular basis. So that forms the heart of the password security management product. So that password breach database, we can take people on a journey to secure their passwords. The first one is simply taking an organization, playing their domain name against that data breach database and say, is anybody in your organization using passwords that are likely to have been breached? So here's a username, here's a password. Yes, that shows on our particular database. You are at risk of somebody using a password that's known to be compromised. The next level is going into the organization and doing what's called a full password audit. So look at their system, look at the passwords in use. Are they shared? Are they reused? Are they weak? Are they known to be compromised? And coming back to the organization with a report, a full audit of your password health. The next step is to address any problems. So how do I enforce people to use strong passwords? So this is a combination of, is my password uppercase, lowercase? Is it strong? Is it known not to have been reused? But importantly, has it known to be compromised? So even if I use a strong password with uppercase, lowercase, a certain length, etc., if that's on a known compromised list, I'm still at risk, but somebody will take that and try and replay it at my system. So this allows you to make sure the passwords you're using are strong and haven't been compromised. And there's a significant amount of self-service in here. So how do we help end users manage those passwords themselves without having to put a load on the help desk? The next step up of security is multi-factor authentication. So by multi-factor, sometimes called strong authentication or two-factor authentication, I'm using 2 factors to authenticate myself. So typically it's something I have, a phone, a smart card, a USB token, and something I know, such as a PIN, or something I am, such as a fingerprint or Face ID. The Authlogics solution set here allows us to plug the gap between passwords and the highest level of multi-factor authentication, PKI and FIDO, that MyID already supports. So these are things like one-time passwords sent to your phone using a PIN or a fingerprint on a device as a biometric, OTPs, one-time passwords sent over SMS, or including hardware tokens such as the YubiKey device, which are commonly used in enterprises. And also on the right, we have the way to actually plug this into those enterprise applications. So logging onto the Windows desktop, for example, with multi-factor authentication, remote access VPN, particularly important in the pandemic, and an increased level of home working is how do people access those systems securely. So that really, again, plugs the gap between the very high level of assurance of MFA that Intercede already provided and allows us to cover passwords and multi-factor authentication. Importantly, to an organization, they want to know what's happening. They need to know the strength of authentication being used if there's any problems. So the Authlogics solution here has a dashboard allowing them to look at what's happening within the organization. Who's using passwords? Are they known to be breached? It may not have been breached yesterday, but it may appear in a data breach the next day, and you want to know that immediately. So what's the risk of those passwords? Same for multi-factor authentication. Who's using what? Who's using software-based? Who's using hardware-based? And this concept really sort of starts to show the single pane of glass management I was referring to as we integrate MyID and the Authlogics product set together. So the idea here is that an organization can look at across their whole authentication within the entire enterprise, who's using PKI, who's using FIDO, who's using MFA, who's using passwords. You can start to see that and manage that from that single pane of glass. And also importantly, as people go on a journey from passwords to PKI and passwordless authentication, we can help transition them to the more secure forms of authentication simply. In terms of where this fits in the market, so this is purely the Authlogics solution to start with. So we have on the bottom right, we have the password breach database. I mentioned there are other versions of that in competitors, so there's DHash, they have been pawned. Move up to the top space, password security management. So that's, are my passwords secure? Have they been changed? Do they meet the password policy? There's probably only a couple of other vendors out there who combine password security management with that password breach database. So that gives us the ability to say, am I using and managing strong passwords, and are they known to be compromised? Once you bring in multi-factor authentication, which is a pretty busy space, there's a lot of multi-factor authentication vendors out there. Some of the traditional ones, RSA, Gemalto, Duo, some of the more modern ones, so Secret Double Octopus and Hyper, who start bringing in FIDO. There isn't a vendor that provides all of this. So an organization will need to use at least 2 products, possibly 3 products to cover this space. But we believe with the Authlogics solution, we can offer a single solution that will both check your passwords haven't been breached and allow you to step up to multi-factor authentication. Adding the Intercede layer over this is where we can cover that whole authentication pyramid. So passwords all the way up to PKI, any point in between, we will allow an organization to move between them and to have that single pane of glass management over them, which is unique in the market. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Klaus.
Thank you, Alan. So Alan's talked about the deal rationale as well as the products in a lot more detail. So what does it mean in terms of markets and total addressable market? Just to repeat, Intercede for the last 20 years has very much focused at the top end, the PKI, the credential management side of this pyramid. It's a market we understand very, very well. We got probably one of the largest skill pools. We also have a phenomenal client base sitting on the back of that. Our clients, for a small company in the UK, our clients are very, very recognizable, and we're probably pushing way above our weight. What we have realized, though, is that PKI market, in terms of absolute size, is a lot smaller than the space beneath bottom end of this pyramid. So if we look at the wider identity and access management space, and in particular the authentication market, the MFA market, PKI is a relatively small proportion of that remaining market that is in the middle and the bottom end of this pyramid. So just over 18 months ago, we started by extending the functionality in the core product to include FIDO. FIDO is an interesting space, originating from the consumer space, but now very much up and coming in the enterprise market. We're one of the first players from a software perspective who can manage both PKI and FIDO in a single platform. That clearly is extending our total addressable market. Again, it's a market that's growing double digit, which is good. But again, it's a lot smaller than the wider MFA space. So the acquisition that we've announced is very much giving us an opportunity to address a much bigger total addressable market, both from an MFA perspective as well as password security management. So what the deal actually allows us to do is sell into a much wider market space. And we believe we've got the right credibility to do it because we have the high end of this pyramid. We have the high end customers. We believe and we know we're credible and going to come across as credible in that mid-market space. Companies are obviously trying to move up from the bottom up, which is far more difficult because their clients tend to be a lot smaller. And, you know, how do you address a Department of State? How do you address a Senate? How do you address a Boeing or a Lockheed Martin when you haven't got the real credibility in that space? We're coming down that pyramid, so we believe we've got that credibility. So what does Authlogics bring to the market in terms of geographies they're covering? They've got a nice spread of customers. The strongest customer base is in the Middle East. There are customers in there that use 40,000 licenses, so we know the platform scales and is credible. They tend to sell multi-year contracts, which is good. We also know the attrition is very, very low. Again, it's something we're very familiar with. Then they have the additional markets they're operating in. Africa, it's a part where we're not particularly active, although we see the first opportunities in South Africa, so we're pursuing those. But it's good to have Authlogics with credibility in the region. We then have UK / continental Europe. You see some names there you recognize, NHS, some banks, but also in North America, clearly, which is where the majority of our revenues are. We see that Authlogics have got some interesting customers also in markets we know well, like banks and the aerospace sector. So we got a real good alignment of client sector. We've also got some good complementary geographies that we can sell into. So what does that then give us from a conclusion perspective? You know, Authlogics acquisition is very much an IP deal for us. You know, we are bringing MFA and password security management to our client base, but also our prospects, and more importantly, our route to market, our channel, our distribution, our reseller network. What it does is give around £500,000 of annual recurring revenue. It's all recurring, so that's good. Again, it's very, very sticky. We talked about the acceleration of the roadmap. It would have taken us 2 to 3 years to build this functionality. And as Alan has explained, with FIPS 201-3 in the US, you know, we have a product that's compliant today, and we can sell into that space. From a technology perspective, we develop on very similar technology stacks. We're both heavily geared towards Microsoft, so we believe integration of both platforms will be relatively straightforward. And from a competitive advantage, you know, individually, MyID is highly competitive. We believe we're market leading. Authlogics is highly competitive with the password data breach, the password security manager, as well as the MFA solution, all built on a single platform. Once we layer MyID on top of that, and as Alan says, we bring that single pane of glass, we think we've got a real strong proposition. And that will obviously give us new opportunities to sell in new markets with an addressable market that's significantly bigger than what we've got. And ultimately, what we believe this will give is enhanced shareholder value going forward. Clearly, this is not the only announcement we brought into the market last week. We also reported on a trading update. So, Nikhil, let me pass on to you the trading update.
Thank you, Klaas. So obviously the other announcement we made was our trading update, and revenues were up 24% to 6.1 million on a like-for-like basis for last year's H1. And again, this is a reflection of what we communicated to the investors and the city in June this year, saying that there was some delay in some of the contracts that we're expecting in FY22 and now feeding into FY23. On a constant revenue basis, obviously the differential was 23%, which is not that far off the 24, and that's mainly reflecting the fact that our support and maintenance income generally comes through and is renewed in March, April, May, and during that period, the volatility in sterling versus the dollar wasn't so high. Obviously, the last month that's not the case, and if the volatility continues, you'll see a bigger differential into H2. We had a really good cash generation for H1. We converted more than a revenue growth at 28%. So we had 10 million at 30th September compared to the 31st of March balance. And after the acquisition, we still had 7.9, circa 8 million in the bank. And the group continues to have no debt. Thanks.
Thank you, Nitil. At this stage, I think I'm handing back to Jake. Jake, you're in the background.
Class, yeah, absolutely. And Alan and Nitil as well, thank you very much indeed for your presentation this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just by using the Q&A tab that's situated on the top right-hand corner of your screen. But just while the team take a few moments to review those questions that were submitted already, I would like to remind you that a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard. Class, Nitil, Alan, we did receive a number of pre-submitted questions ahead of today's event, which you have kindly already provided written responses to, and of course we'll publish those to investors immediately after the call. But we have also received a number of questions during today's presentation itself as well. So firstly, thank you to all of those on the call for taking the time to submit their questions. And if I could just hand back to you to respond to those questions where it's appropriate to do so, and then I'll pick up from you at the end. Thank you.
Okay, so right now we will only focus on the questions that are submitted in our Q&A box. All the questions that were submitted have been pre-answered and will be published, as Jake said, immediately after the presentation. So Matthew has got the first question out there. How do you look to cross-sell into both your and Authlogics' existing clients? How big is the organic opportunity in revenue terms? So as of today, both product lines are available to be cross-sold into the existing client base. So the Intercede salespeople will immediately have access to the Authlogics products and vice versa. So that's basically happening from day one. We already see the first opportunities appearing in the pipeline. In fact, even before the acquisition was announced, we were carefully managing certain requests for proposal and requests for information as they came along. So opportunities already exist in the pipeline. The second question is more difficult to answer. How big is the organic opportunity in revenue terms? The only thing I think to put that into focus a little bit more is a lot of our existing clients where we sell MyID licenses also have an existing MFA solution, and where we may have 20, 30, 40, 50,000 licenses for our software, they typically have multiples of that in terms of MFA. So we definitely think there is a significant upside opportunity, not just in our installed base, but also in opportunities going forward. And definitely once both products are integrated, I think we have a real good opportunity there. So that was Matthew. Sorry, there's a lot of questions coming in, so I need to scroll back to the top. Second question is also from Matthew. Does the deal take you into new geographies? Yes, it does. Clearly, we have some presence with clients in the Middle East, but Authlogics is very, very well established in the Middle East. They're very established across Africa. So they're definitely new geographies. Vice versa, we are far more established in North America, and I was actually personally in the US last week talking to partners and channels, and they're very keen to get the product into their hands so they can extend it from there. Next question is from Steve. Do you have a level of your free cash flow that you will use for acquisitions, or will you return to shareholders and surplus? Nitil, here's one for you.
Thank you. So we obviously have a very strict criteria for our M&A, and we'll continue to adhere to that. At the moment, the size of the acquisition dictates what we'll be doing. But the category at the moment is using our existing cash resources for the acquisitions that we can sustain the level of cash conversion, not just in the target, but also in the group. And then we'll obviously look at debt. And although debt is getting more expensive, in light of the interest rate movement. And then the last element is obviously shares or shareholders, purely because of our share price being so low. At the moment, it does really depend on the target. We're not ruling anything out, but we are concentrating on the top end of using our cash generation, and then we'll look at the other tiers going forward. But it does primarily depend on the size of the acquisition.
Thank you, Nitil. Next question is from Andrew. Do you think many of your existing PKI users will switch from PKI to FIDO or lower authentication in response to new US regulation? Which is followed by a second question. Do you see the PKI market continuing to grow? Alan, one for you.
Yep. So good question. And there is two answers to it. If the customer is driven by the US regulation FIPS 1, so federal government or aerospace and defense, that regulation still states that the primary identity has to be PKI based. So that is not removing that PKI market. However, you are allowed to use additional types of authenticator in addition to that PKI. So that could be down the supply chain, it could be accessing different applications. So we see that as being additive. Outside of that federal government regulation, we are seeing people interested in a wider range of authentication. So one of our big European manufacturing organizations is currently looking at how can they use PKI for some customers, some of their staff, and how can they use FIDO for others of their staff? Because it very much depends on the role. If you're signing emails, you work in finance, PKI works well. If you're home-based, you're just accessing cloud systems, FIDO works better. So for those driven by the regulation, it's PKI plus additional credentials. For those outside of that regulation, we're really seeing people want a hybrid authentication. So some will be using PKI and some will be using FIDO.
Thank you. Next question from Andrew. Is it a big job to integrate the Authlogics products into Intercede's technology stack so that you can offer customers that single pane of glass?
Yes, another good question, which I assumed was coming at me. So this was a key part of the due diligence. So how could we actually integrate this product stack together? And the good news is that the Authlogics product suite has a good set of REST APIs, which means we can integrate and provide that overlay management. Day one, we can sell them as standalone products. Once they're integrated, we have that unique proposition in. Ballpark, we're probably looking at 3 to 6 months to have that available.
Thank you. Last question is probably one for you, Nitil. Hi, are you able to give a forecast estimate for full year revenues?
No, I'm not. Unfortunately, that's a forward forecast, and the group cannot put those forecasts out. Our Nomad broker will do that, and there will be an update in November when we come up with our H1 results.
That concludes the full set of questions. All pre-submitted questions have been answered, so we won't go through those. So, Jack, I'll hand back to you.
Class, thank you very much. And Alan and Nitil as well, thank you very much indeed for addressing all of those questions that came in from investors this afternoon. And of course, if any further questions do come through, we'll make these available to you immediately after the presentation has ended for you to review, and then add any additional responses where it's appropriate to do so. Class, perhaps before redirecting those on the call to provide you with their feedback, which I know is particularly important to yourself and the company, if I could please just ask you for a few closing comments to wrap up with, that'd be great.
Yep, thank you, Jake. So following the Authlogics acquisition, as well as a solid start in H1, we're looking forward to the integration of the new business, as well as continuing with our organic growth for the second half. We have a highly committed group and loyal team of colleagues, who day after day deliver the best scalable revenue growth and profitability, and we maintain our forecast for the full year. Thank you again for attending, and we look forward to updating you all again in November. Thank you.
Class, that's great. And Alan and Nitil as well, thank you once again for taking the time to update investors today. Could I please ask investors not to close this session, as you'll now be automatically redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This won't take a few moments to complete, but I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of Intercede Group PLC, we would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That now concludes today's session, so good afternoon to you all.